I was a xenobiologist assigned to Inquisitorial Ordo Xenos, a specialist in alien physiology and metaphysics, which meant I'd spent 23 years studying creatures that most Imperial citizens would be executed for even acknowledging existed. My work took me to the edges of known space, to worlds where humanity's grip was tenuous and Xeno's influence pervasive. And I documented everything with the clinical detachment that kept me sane when confronted with truths that would break lesser minds. I'd dissected organisms that violated every principle of biology I'd been taught, analyzed technologies that shouldn't function according to Imperial science, interviewed survivors of encounters with things that shouldn't exist. I thought I'd seen everything, thought I'd developed immunity to horror through constant exposure, thought my faith in the Emperor and my dedication to knowledge would protect me from the existential dread that claimed other xenobiologists. I was wrong. The truth I discovered on the research station orbiting the dead world of Ashenmere didn't just challenge my understanding, it shattered it completely, left me with knowledge I can never unknow, with certainty I wish desperately I could unlearn. The station was designated Research Facility Epsilon 779, a small installation hidden in the debris field of a planet that had been virus-bombed millennia ago during the Great Crusade, its population of 17 billion reduced to ash and bone by exterminatus protocols that were standard procedure when faster methods of compliance failed. The Inquisitor I served, a woman named Vestra who dedicated her life to understanding Xeno's threats so humanity could better fight them, had established the facility specifically to study artifacts recovered from Eldar raid sites, to understand how these ancient aliens thought, how they fought, what weaknesses we might exploit. My role was analysis, documentation, careful examination of materials too dangerous to transport to more populated worlds, too valuable to destroy without first extracting every possible insight. I'd been stationed there for 8 months, working with a team of 6 other specialists, janitors, tech priests, savants, all of us bound by oaths of secrecy and psychic shielding that prevented us from discussing our work with anyone lacking proper clearance. The isolation was deliberate, necessary, designed to contain knowledge that could cause mass panic if it spread beyond those trained to process it. The artifact arrived on a transport from a battlefield on the sector's edge, delivered in a stasis field by inquisitorial stormtroopers who refused to answer questions about where exactly they'd recovered it or what casualties they'd taken securing it. It was approximately 2 meters long, shaped like an elongated teardrop, constructed from some material that looked like crystallized starlight that seemed to shift between solid and liquid states when observed from different angles, that hummed with a frequency I felt in my bones rather than heard with my ears. The surface was covered in runes that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to rearrange themselves when you weren't focusing on them, writing in a language that predated humanity's emergence as a species. Inquisitor Vestra was ecstatic. This was an intact Eldar artifact, possibly a soul stone, possibly something even more significant, and studying it could provide insights into Xeno's metaphysics that would advance Imperial understanding by decades. She ordered immediate analysis, authorized use of any resources necessary, personally oversaw the initial examination protocols. I should have recognized the warning signs. Should have paid attention to the way servitors malfunctioned when brought near the artifact, their cognitive processors unable to pass data from its proximity, their biological components exhibiting distress responses that shouldn't have been possible given their neural modifications. Should have noticed how the station's tech priests grew increasingly uneasy, performing blessing rituals with unusual frequency, muttering prayers to the machine, God that emphasized protection rather than understanding. Should have listened when the astropath assigned to the station reported nightmares of vast hunger and endless screaming, dreams that left her weeping and unable to properly perform her duties. But I was too focused on the work, too excited by the opportunity to study something this significant, too invested in my reputation as the xenobiologist who could maintain objectivity regardless of what horrors she encountered. I ignored the warnings because acknowledging them would mean admitting I was afraid, would mean accepting that some knowledge might be too dangerous to pursue, and I'd built my entire career on the principle that understanding was always preferable to ignorance. The first breach occurred on my third day examining the artifact. I'd been using specialized scanning equipment to analyze its internal structure, trying to understand how something so physically small could generate the energy signatures our instruments detected, when the readings suddenly spiked beyond measurement range and the artifact simply opened. Not mechanically, not through any mechanism I could identify, but opened the way a flower blooms or an eye dilates, the crystalline surface peeling back to reveal an interior that shouldn't have been possible given the exterior dimensions, a space that extended into directions my eyes couldn't quite process. That made my inner ear scream with vertigo, even though I was standing perfectly still. Inside was something that looked like light made solid, like captured starlight woven into intricate patterns, and within those patterns I could see shapes, humanoid shapes, hundreds of them, thousands, all screaming silently in a void that had no air to carry sound. I stumbled backward, knocked over monitoring equipment, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force I thought it might crack bone. The tech priest working with me, an elderly adept named Macharius, who'd spent 40 years serving the Mechanicus, let out a sound I'd never heard him make, something between prayer and whimper, and began frantically performing the sign of the cog, while backing toward the chamber's exit. The shapes inside the artifact were moving, writhing, pressing against some invisible barrier that contained them, their mouths open in screams I couldn't hear, but could somehow feel, vibrations that resonated in my skull and chest and made my teeth ache. They had faces, distinct, individual faces showing every variation of terror and anguish and despair that human expression could convey, and I realized with sick certainty that these weren't artistic representations or symbolic imagery. These were actual consciousnesses, actual souls, trapped inside this crystalline prison and aware of their imprisonment. The artifact sealed itself after perhaps 30 seconds of exposure, the crystalline surface flowing back into place like water finding its level, hiding the horror I'd glimpsed behind that deceptively beautiful exterior. I stood there shaking, my scientific training warring with the primal terror that flooded my nervous system, trying to rationalize what I'd seen in terms that made sense according to imperial doctrine and established xenobiological principles. Macharius had fled completely, his loyalty to the Omnissiah temporarily overridden by self-preservation instinct. I activated the Vox system, contacted Inquisitor Vestra, reported what had occurred using the clinical language I'd been trained to employ when discussing disturbing findings. She arrived within minutes, accompanied by 2 psychers and an interrogator who carried weapons designed to kill Xenos constructs. Together we reviewed the recorded data from the incident, watched the sensor logs that showed energy patterns inconsistent with any known technology, studied the brief footage captured before my equipment overloaded. "It's a waystone," Vestra said finally, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd suspected this, but needed confirmation. The Eldar used them to capture souls at the moment of death to prevent those souls from being consumed by other entities. This is how they cheat damnation, how they preserve themselves beyond physical death. Each of those consciousnesses you saw represents an individual Eldar who died believing their soul would be safely contained, would eventually be transferred to their Craftworlds infinity circuit, where they'd exist in a form of digital immortality alongside their ancestors. She paused, studying the frozen image on the monitor showing those screaming faces, those expressions of absolute horror. Except this one isn't functioning properly, or perhaps it is functioning exactly as designed, and what we think we understand about Eldar soul preservation technology is fundamentally wrong. The investigation that followed consumed the next 6 weeks and revealed truths that made the initial discovery seem almost innocent by comparison. We analyzed 17 other artifacts that had been recovered from various sites, some intact like the first, others damaged or partially destroyed, and every single one contained the same thing, trapped consciousnesses exhibiting distress responses consistent with ongoing torture. We discovered that the energy signatures we'd initially attributed to power sources were actually emanations from the contained souls themselves. That the artifacts were somehow harvesting psychological suffering and converting it into a form of sustenance. That what the Eldar called soul stones were actually elaborate feeding mechanisms for something we couldn't see, but could measure through its effects on local reality. The psychers assigned to study this reported sensing vast hunger whenever they attempted to analyze the artifacts psychically, an appetite that was ancient and patient and utterly inhuman in its parameters. I found documentation in our research archives, classified reports from other inquisitors, interrogation transcripts from captured Eldar, theological analyses from the Ordo Malleus, that painted a picture so disturbing I initially refused to accept it despite the evidence. The Eldar, we'd always been taught, were a dying species clinging to existence through superior technology and desperate survival strategies, refugees from a catastrophe of their own making who fought humanity not from malice, but from the simple fact that resources in the galaxy were finite and two intelligent species could not coexist peacefully. This was comfortable narrative, one that cast the Imperium as the rightful inheritors of the galaxy, humanity as the species destiny favored, the Emperor's armies as instruments of inevitable triumph. But the documents I uncovered suggested something far more complex and infinitely more troubling. The Eldar weren't just preserving their souls in these waystones, they were feeding them to something. Deliberately. Systematically. As part of bargains made 10,000 years ago when their species teetered on the brink of extinction and chose survival at any cost over extinction with dignity intact. The entity they fed was called She Who Thirsts in some texts, the Great Enemy in others, described in terms so euphemistic I initially missed the implication, but cross-referencing multiple sources and combining them with my own observations of how the artifacts functioned revealed the truth. When the Eldar Empire fell, when their collective depravity birthed something that fed on sensation and emotion and consciousness itself, they didn't find a solution to their damnation. They found a compromise. They couldn't stop their souls from being consumed. That was inevitable, built into the metaphysical architecture of the disaster they'd created. But they could control the pace of consumption, could offer their dead as tribute in measured quantities, could buy time for the living through sacrificing the deceased. The waystones weren't prisons protecting souls. They were offering plates, carefully designed to keep consciousness intact and suffering for as long as possible, because suffering was what the entity craved, because raw agony generated more psychic energy than peaceful death, because every soul trapped in those crystalline hells was screaming not just from their own torment, but from the knowledge that their suffering was keeping the great enemy fed, and thus preventing it from immediately consuming every living Eldar in the galaxy. I confronted Inquisitor Vestra with this theory, presented my evidence, demanded she acknowledge what we'd discovered. She listened patiently, reviewed my compiled data, and then told me something I'll never forget. You're correct in your analysis. This has been suspected for centuries, confirmed through various sources, and deliberately suppressed because the implications are too dangerous for general imperial knowledge. If citizens understood that one of our primary Xenos opponents isn't actually opposing some external threat, but is instead engaged in a 10,000-year program of ritualized sacrifice to forestall their own extinction, it raises questions we'd prefer remain unasked. Questions like, what would humanity do in similar circumstances? Would the Imperium choose extinction over compromise with entities we consider demonic? Has the Imperium perhaps already made such compromises in ways we're not acknowledging? These are not productive lines of inquiry for maintaining morale and faith. I should have stopped there. Should have accepted that some truths are classified for good reason. That knowledge without context or ability to act on it is just poison that corrupts understanding without providing benefit. But I couldn't let it go. I needed to understand the full scope of what I'd discovered, needed to trace the implications to their logical conclusion. I began accessing restricted archives, using my clearance to review materials that were technically available to me, but which I'd never had reason to examine before. I found records of Imperial encounters with Eldar going back millennia, found patterns in how the aliens behaved during raids and battles, found correlations that suggested their attacks on human worlds weren't random piracy or territorial aggression, but carefully calculated harvesting operations. They took prisoners, always prisoners when possible, living humans captured and transported away to unknown locations, never seen again. Their fates never determined despite inquisitorial investigation. The conclusion was inescapable and absolutely horrifying. The Eldar weren't just feeding their own souls to the great enemy. They were supplementing their tribute with human souls, with our consciousness, with citizens of the Imperium captured and subjected to the same fate as deceased Eldar, trapped in waystones or equivalent devices, kept conscious and suffering, harvested for the psychic energy their torment generated. We weren't fighting a war of conquest or survival against the Eldar. We were livestock, additional resources they could exploit to reduce the rate at which they needed to sacrifice their own population. Disposable consciousnesses whose damnation meant nothing to them, but whose suffering could buy their species another decade, another century of continued existence. I brought this analysis to Vestra with all supporting documentation, demanded immediate action, insisted we inform higher authorities and request emergency intervention to rescue any humans still trapped in Eldar soul harvesting apparatus. She reviewed my work carefully, nodded her acknowledgement of its accuracy, and then told me something that finally broke my faith in the mission I'd dedicated my life to serving. No. The Inquisition has known for centuries. The High Lords have been informed. The decision has been made that taking action against this practice would require resources we cannot spare, would necessitate a crusade against the Eldar of sufficient scope, that it would leave other fronts vulnerable, would risk alerting the broader population to metaphysical realities they're better off not understanding. The humans the Eldar harvest number in the tens of thousands annually across the entire galaxy, statistically insignificant compared to total Imperial casualties from all causes. Attempting to save them would cost millions of lives and potentially destabilize our strategic position across multiple sectors. It is, unfortunately, an acceptable loss. I felt something crack inside me then. Some fundamental assumption about the Imperium's nature that I'd never consciously examined, but which had supported my entire worldview. We weren't fighting to save every human life. We weren't working to protect our species from all threats. We were managing, calculating, making cost-benefit determinations that treated individual lives as numerical abstractions, that accepted certain horrors as inevitable and therefore not worth opposing. The Emperor protects, we said constantly, but the protection was conditional, limited to populations whose salvation was strategically valuable, whose rescue wouldn't compromise other objectives deemed more important by authorities so distant from the suffering they managed that it couldn't possibly feel real to them. The nightmares started the following week. I'd dream I was inside one of the waystones, trapped in that crystalline prison, aware of thousands of other consciousnesses pressing against me, all of us screaming without sound, all of us knowing we'd been abandoned, that no rescue was coming, that our suffering would continue for decades or centuries until the entity we fed grew bored with our agony or finally consumed us completely. I'd wake gasping, my quarters seeming too small, the recycled air of the station tasting stale and wrong. The station's Medicaid prescribed sedatives that did nothing except make the nightmares more vivid, more difficult to distinguish from waking reality. I started seeing faces in the reflective surfaces of the research equipment, started hearing whispers in the station's ventilation systems, started feeling watched whenever I worked alone in the laboratory spaces. The other researchers were experiencing similar symptoms. All of us had been exposed to the artifacts, had spent weeks in proximity to trapped consciousnesses screaming their eternal torment, had absorbed knowledge that violated our understanding of how the universe should function. 2 of the janitors requested immediate transfer, citing psychological strain and diminished capacity to perform their duties. A tech priest suffered complete psychological breakdown and had to be sedated and shipped back to Mars for rehabilitation. The savant who'd been cataloging recovered artifacts stopped sleeping entirely, spent his nights staring at monitors showing recorded footage of the waystone's interiors. muttering calculations about how many human souls the Eldar had harvested over 10,000 years, how many were currently trapped, how many would be trapped in the coming millennia if nothing changed. I tried to continue working, tried to maintain professional detachment, tried to convince myself that documenting these horrors served a purpose, that knowledge would eventually lead to solution, that understanding the mechanisms of Eldar soul harvesting would allow the Imperium to develop countermeasures or rescue operations. But I couldn't escape the certainty that my work was ultimately futile, that the decision to accept this as inevitable had already been made at levels so far above me that my opinions were irrelevant, that I was documenting atrocities purely for the sake of documentation, creating records that would be classified and sealed and never acted upon, because action would be inconvenient or expensive or politically complicated. Inquisitor Vestra noticed my deterioration, of course. She was too experienced, too observant to miss the signs of psychological compromise in her subordinates. She called me to her office on the station's command level, offered me recaf that I accepted but didn't drink, and spoke with the wary patience of someone who'd had this conversation before. "You're not the first xenobiologist to be broken by this knowledge. You won't be the last. The human mind isn't designed to process certain truths. We evolved to understand immediate, local threats, to form social bonds with limited groups, to believe in justice and meaning and purpose. Discovering that the universe operates on principles that violate those evolved intuitions causes predictable psychological damage. I can have you transferred, can arrange memory modification to excise the specific knowledge that's causing you distress, can provide whatever support you need to continue functioning. But I need to know, can you keep working? Can you maintain security protocols? Can you be trusted not to attempt unauthorized disclosure of what you've learned?" I told her I could. I lied. I'd already decided that if I couldn't save the souls trapped in those waystones, if the Imperium had genuinely abandoned them to eternal torment for the sake of strategic convenience, then at the very minimum I could document what I'd learned, could create a record that couldn't be easily suppressed, could ensure that someone, somewhere, eventually understood the full scope of the horror humanity faced and the moral compromises our species had made in the name of survival. I began compiling a comprehensive report, storing encrypted copies in multiple locations, preparing to transmit it to contacts I'd maintained outside inquisitorial oversight, individuals who had the resources and motivation to disseminate information the Inquisition preferred to keep classified. I was discovered, inevitably, before I could complete the transmission. Station security detected anomalous data access patterns, traced them to my workstation, reported to Vestra, who authorized immediate containment. I was arrested by stormtroopers who'd been stationed specifically to prevent this kind of security breach. Taken to a holding cell that had been constructed for exactly this purpose, informed that I would undergo interrogation to determine the extent of my unauthorized disclosures and whether I'd been compromised by Xenos influence or had simply succumbed to psychological strain. The interrogator was professional, almost kind, explained that this wasn't personal, that they understood my distress, that memory modification would leave me functional and happy, able to return to xenobiological work without the burden of knowledge that had broken my capacity to serve effectively. I don't know if the modification was successful. I don't know if what I'm remembering now is actual experience or reconstructed false memory, if my certainty about Eldar soul harvesting is based on genuine discovery or paranoid delusion induced by prolonged exposure to Xenos artifacts. The interrogator's final words before administering the neural programming suggested this ambiguity was deliberate. "We're going to help you, but you'll never be entirely sure whether the help consisted of removing truth you couldn't handle or removing delusions that felt like truth. This uncertainty will protect you from obsessive fixation. This uncertainty will allow you to function. Trust in the Emperor's mercy. Trust that the Imperium acts righteously even when you cannot understand its reasoning. Trust that your suffering serves purpose beyond your comprehension." I'm writing this in a research facility I don't entirely remember being assigned to, working on projects that seem simultaneously familiar and strange, surrounded by colleagues whose faces I recognize, but whose names escape me. Sometimes I dream of crystalline prisons filled with screaming souls. Sometimes I wake certain that I've discovered terrible truth about our Xenos enemies. Sometimes I catch myself starting to compile evidence about Eldar soul harvesting practices, only to lose track of what I was doing, to find my notes deleted or encrypted beyond my ability to access. I don't know if I'm a xenobiologist who discovered something real and was modified to forget it, or if I'm a damaged researcher trapped in delusions that feel like memories, or if perhaps the distinction between those states has become meaningless. What I know with certainty is that somewhere in the galaxy, human souls are trapped in devices designed to harvest their suffering, are screaming silently in prisons that keep them conscious and aware, and tormented for purposes they'll never understand. And the Imperium that claims to protect humanity has calculated their rescue would be inconvenient, has determined their damnation is an acceptable price for strategic stability, has chosen to preserve resources rather than save citizens whose only crime was being captured by enemies we've been fighting for 10,000 years, without ever truly understanding what we opposed or why opposition mattered. The Emperor protects. We repeat this constantly, automatically, a mantra that defines imperial faith and purpose. But protection has limits, has boundaries, has calculations that determine who deserves salvation and who can be abandoned to horrors beyond imagination, because saving them would compromise other objectives, other populations, other strategic priorities that someone far away has determined matter more than the individuals screaming in crystalline hells. This is the truth I may or may not have discovered, may or may not be remembering correctly, may or may not be allowed to keep understanding. The Imperium is not about saving every human life. It's about preserving humanity as collective, as species, as empire, and individual suffering is just mathematics, just acceptable loss, just necessary sacrifice that those doing the sacrificing will never acknowledge, because acknowledgement would require confronting the monstrosity of what we've become in the name of survival. I don't know if this account is real memory or constructed delusion. I don't know if I'm documenting truth or generating fiction that feels true, because my damaged mind needs narrative to explain psychological trauma. I don't know if anyone will ever read this, or if it matters whether they do. What I know is that uncertainty itself is torture. That not knowing whether your suffering serves purpose is worse than knowing it doesn't. That the Imperium's greatest cruelty might not be its acceptance of horrors, but its unwillingness to acknowledge that acceptance, to admit that we've compromised everything we claim to value in service of pure survival divorced from meaning or morality or justice. The Eldar harvest souls to feed the entity their depravity created. The Imperium harvests faith to feed the machinery of empire. Both species are trapped in cycles they cannot escape, both feeding endless hungers they cannot satisfy, both damning portions of their populations to fates worse than death, because the alternative is collective extinction. This is the horrifying truth I may have discovered. We're not so different from the Xenos we oppose. We've just convinced ourselves our compromises are righteous, our sacrifices necessary, our horrors justified by context and circumstance, and the impossible burden of steering a species through a universe that wants us dead. The Emperor protects. Some of us, sometimes, when it's convenient, when the cost-benefit analysis favors intervention. The rest of us scream in crystalline prisons, or hive manufactorums, or battlefield trenches, or wherever our suffering serves purposes we're not permitted to question. This is the Imperium. This is humanity's truth. This is the price of survival in a galaxy where mercy is weakness and compassion is strategic liability. I may be mad. I may be wrong. I may be remembering things that never happened or forgetting modifications that rewrote my understanding of reality. But somewhere, right now, souls are screaming, human souls, Eldar souls. Consciousness trapped and harvested and consumed in cycles that have continued for millennia and will continue for millennia more, because no one with power to intervene has determined that intervention is worth the cost. This is what I remember. This is what I believe. This is what the Imperium would prefer I forget, what they may have already made me forget, what I might be hallucinating into false significance because my mind broke under the weight of knowledge, It was never designed to carry. The truth doesn't matter. The suffering continues either way, and we continue serving, continue fighting, continue believing in protection that only extends as far as strategic necessity permits, because the alternative is accepting that everything we've sacrificed was meaningless, that every horror we've witnessed was preventable, that the Imperium we serve is no better than the Xenos we oppose, just more numerous, more organized, more efficient at converting consciousness into fuel for empires that will outlast anyone trapped in their machinery. May the Emperor protect us. May he protect even those he's already abandoned. May someone, somewhere, find mercy for the souls we've determined aren't worth saving.